this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Just 2 days before D-Day, Captain Gallery's anti-submarine task group managed to force the German U-boat U-505 to the surface. In a bold move, a boarding party secured the submarine before it could be scuttled, capturing an Enigma machine and the current Kriegsmarine codebooks. This remarkable operation earned Lieutenant Albert David the Medal of Honor for his leadership. However, it could have had catastrophic consequences. If the Germans had suspected that their ciphers were compromised, it might have jeopardised the Allied Operation Ultra, which was already decrypting German signals. The chief of US naval operations, Ernest King, was so incensed about the capture of U-505 that he threatened to fire Admiral Gallery. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today to discuss this incredible operation is Charles Lachman, author of Codename Nemo, The Hunt for a Nazi U-boat and the Elusive Enigma Machine. Welcome, Charles. So let's start by looking at U-505, which is now on display at the Science and Industry Museum in Chicago, and who features in that wartime newsreel, Now It Can Be Told. I think U-505 was launched in 1941, and we're discussing 1944, when it had 11 patrols. So what kind of service had it seen?
Well, it didn't have a spectacular record. Thank goodness for that. After all, they were fighting for the Nazis. It had what I would consider to be a respectable service record. It knocked down, I believe, 8 merchant marine ships, some British, some American, 1 Dutch. But when it came back to its port in France, after its first excursion, the head of the Nazi U-boat fleet wrote down in U-505's diary basically the word respectable. So it didn't have an illustrious record, which is why the crew was so charged with trying to improve its kill rate.
But I was at the same time, it hadn't exactly been lucky. It's a funny book because I've been looking. His second commander commits suicide whilst at sea, which struck me as being must be highly unusual.
It was the only time in the German Navy's history that a commanding officer committed suicide while in battle. I mean, really it was extraordinary. He was never fit to be a commander. He had all the background and credibility of the typical Third Reich naval officer. His father was a Navy doctor. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy. He looked the part. He looked like a member of the Aryan race, but he had drinking issues. He was a terrible leader of men. His men despised him, and he panicked in the face of duty. U-505 was under the surface, making its way through the Bay of Biscayne at the time, and it was being pounded by British destroyers with the depth charges, and it was really getting pulverized. And he couldn't handle it. He took a Luger revolver to his brain, and he pulled the trigger. He did not immediately die, but they were concerned about the noise, the rattling death noise that he was making, that it would be picked up by British sonar. So his men actually smothered him to death. They put a pillow over his face, and they, like he was already half dead, but they ended his life, his own men. His burial was pathetic. After they got out of that drama with the British destroyer, they rose to the surface and they bound him in a burial sheath, and the men didn't even stand at attention when his body was carried through the control room, up the ladder, and out on top deck, and they buried him at sea. So this was a tremendous embarrassment to the Kriegsmarine service when they radioed in that the commanding officer had committed suicide. Admiral Donitz, the head of the fleet, couldn't believe it. So he immediately ordered U-505 to return to France, and so that they could basically figure it out. Back then, if you lost your commanding officer, your cruise was at an end.
The next commander's Harold. Is it Harold Lang that takes over from him.
Not Langer, yes. He was the third and last commanding officer of U-505. And he was a interesting character. He was, of the three commanding officers of U-505, he was the only member of the Nazi Party. Now, looking back 80 years now, it's difficult to say whether that was due to politics or practicality, that he saw his service he was back then in the Merchant Marine, the German version of the Merchant Marines, whether he saw that as necessary for his career. He was a chain smoker. He was 6 foot tall, which was unusually tall for a U-boat crewman. And he had the competence of a leader. They called him the old man. He was only 44 years old. But, back then, this was a young man's game. Peter Zesch, who was the CO who committed suicide, was only 24, and Lange was 44.
So let's look from the Americans' perspective. Our other major protagonists from the American point of view will be Dan Gallery. So he's in command of Task Group 22.3 with the USS Guadalcanal as the flagship. Now, I was going to say, there's so many questions here. Who's Dan Gallery? What's a task group? Because the Guadalcanal's not a big fleet carrier, is it, like the Yorktown? What are they doing?
They called it a baby flat top. It was about half the size of the majestic aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy during World War II. It was about 500 plus feet long. So it had a much shorter runway for planes to land, and it was obviously much more dangerous for those flights. And basically, it was designed to be built on the cheap. The whole point was to get the war was won because of mass production, and the idea of the construction of the Guadalcanal and other baby flat tops like it was to kind of bring the mentality, the mindset of the Ford Motor Company, mass production and the assembly line production to the U.S. Navy. So they built dozens of these flat tops, and they were built by Rosie the Riveter. And kids really out of high school who, for one reason or other, they weren't military eligible, but a lot of them were women. There's a real concern when among the U.S. sailors, is this thing gonna float when it was launched? But it turned out to be a well-constructed, impactful vessel. And Dan Gallery, you ask about him. Dan Gallery was at that point a captain in the U.S. Navy. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy. He came from an Irish-American family in Chicago. His father was a prominent lawyer there. His mother was a writer for the Archdiocese. He had 4 brothers. One of them was a Catholic priest, and the other 3 all became, including Dan Gallery, rear admirals in the U.S. Navy. And he was this kind of fighting Irishman. He was like 5'6", and he was a brilliant leader of men and a innovator. He was a maverick. And when he was assigned to command the USS Guadalcanal, an aircraft carrier, he had this dream of going to the Pacific, where these great naval battles, Midway and the Battle of Guadalcanal, were being fought. Well, what did the Navy do? They sent him to the Atlantic, and he was so disappointed. But, he turned it around and made naval history with the capture of U-505. He was a brilliant strategist and innovator.
So what are they tasked with? Convoy escorts with the task group?
He wasn't not so much a convoy escort. He set out to hunt and kill U-boat. He did not put a screening field around merchant marine convoys. That was not his mission. Instead, as you point out, the Guadalcanal was the lead vessel in this task force, and it consisted of 5 other destroyer escorts, which were there to seek out and destroy U-boats, but also to protect the Guadalcanal. As you know, Guadalcanal is like the old lady in a bar fight. You have to leave the bar because you have no business being in a bar fight if you're an old lady. Well, that's really the concept of the aircraft carrier. It was really a floating runway. It was designed to bring naval planes to the fight. And the escorts were there to not only seek out and destroy the U-boats, but also to protect the Guadalcanal, because except for one, no German U-boat had ever sunk an aircraft carrier during the war.
So had they had any success with U-boats? Had they before 505?
Well, yes, he had. There was one battle engagement that really triggered this whole idea of capturing U-505. And that was a few months before this eventful U-505 engagement. He encountered another U-boat, same battle plan, pulverized by the back then it was Task Force 22.1. It pulverized this U-boat, and with depth charges and hedgehog attacks, these kind of mortars, and the U-boat was brought to the surface, and the men bailed. They abandoned ship, and it gave him the idea that this U-boat was still kind of functionable. It could still open fire. In fact, it did let loose with one torpedo. These Germans, who supposedly would die for the fatherland and for the Führer, there they were, not fighting back. They were fleeing. They were jumping into the water. They wanted to live another day. This was Easter Sunday, 1944, and when they were rescued by the American vessels that were surrounding them, one officer said, "Happy Easter." They couldn't be more delighted that the war was over for them. Yeah, they would be POWs, but a POW in an American prison camp, let me say, not a big deal. They were fine with that. But it triggered something in Gallery's head. He already had the idea of trying to capture a U-boat on the high seas. But when he saw that these supposedly rabid, hardcore Nazi sailors were abandoning ship, well, he said, you know what? If I thought this through a little bit more, maybe we could actually seize one before the U-boat sank.
What's interesting about his idea to seize one, I assume he's not privy to the fact that the British and the Americans are reading the ultra decrypts. So it's potentially problematic capturing a U-boat. Does he articulate his plan to anybody what he's want to capture a U-boat?
Yes, he did. He told a couple of people at the Pentagon after Task Force 22.1 came back to the U.S. Naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. He went to the Pentagon for more of a debrief, and that was there that he told a couple of his old buddies who he knew for years and years in the Navy Department that he was thinking of seizing the next U-boat that he encountered. And one of these officers was this brilliant guy who Dan Gallery called the soothsayer, because he was uncanny in his prediction of where these U-boats were located. Dan Gallery didn't know that the soothsayer was privy to the communications that the Brits and also the Americans were. They were reading the German naval, the Enigma machine. They were reading the code, but they only had a general idea. They couldn't pinpoint the exact location. They give a general vicinity of where the U-boat was located, and then it was up to whatever task force it was to locate through sonar and other mechanisms the exact presence of the U-boat. But it certainly helped give them a general demarcation of where they should concentrate their forces. But Gallery had no idea that he may have suspected, but he didn't articulate the fact that the Brits and the Americans had deciphered the Enigma machine.
So when he comes across U-505, is it the task group that finds 505, or is it 505 that finds them? But I assume ideally a U-boat would be wanting to steer clear of any form of task group like Gallery's.
They kind of stumbled into each other. Dan Gallery knew that there was a U-boat out there through sonar readings and also through the soothsayer's communication. He said that it was in the general vicinity. The U-boat commander, Lange, he was heading home, and he was running out of fuel. His batteries were in dire shape, and it had been a disappointing cruise for the U-boat. They had not found any enemy vessels. They had not fired a single torpedo. He was actually eating his lunch, and he was in his pajamas, silk black pajamas, and he was sitting down after lunch in his cabin for a rest when suddenly, his men wake him and said, "We've got a problem here." And when he went into the control room, he raised the periscope and he, oh my God, U.S. destroyer. Then he turned the periscope, oh, another U.S. destroyer. He saw 3 U.S. destroyers, actually 5 in total. And then in the distance, he saw an aircraft carrier. So his words were, "Oh my God," and other more choice words. and he realized that he was in the middle of a U.S. hunter-killer task force.
So Galleries wanted to capture a U-boat. How do you capture a U-boat without sinking it?
Well, amazing, isn't it? Just the idea of it. I mean, how do you? Which is why the exhibit at the Chicago Museum is so extraordinary, where the U-boat is now on exhibit. I mean, when I saw it for the first time, I said, "How is this even possible?" Which is what was so intriguing about the story, which is what set me going on the book. Well, what happened was that when his task force set out in March 1944 from Norfolk Naval Base, he got his commanding officers together from the 5 destroyer escorts, and he ordered them to find 9 or so volunteers. Each ship had its own raiding party, organized its own raiding party. I'm going to focus on the USS Pillsbury because that was the key one. So on the Pillsbury, they picked the leader of the raiding party, a guy named Lieutenant Albert David, and he went around the ship and he signed these volunteers up. And, U.S. Navy guys, they were just kids. They were just out of high school. They don't, they were brave guys. And they said, all right, yeah. So they signed up, but each one had a certain mission. So they actually studied the blueprints, and they each had their own assignment. So there was a couple of gunnery officers and a radio guy and an engineer, and they would meet each day on the Pillsbury, where they climbed into a whaleboat, and they carried all their heavy equipment, which included chains, crowbars, weaponry, and they tried to cut down the time that they would get into the whaleboat for what would be expected to be a brief journey to the U-boat. But they were like almost joking about it. Yeah, right. What a cockamamie idea. Gallery, yeah, another crazy idea from the captain. They had not even a remote chance in their mind that this would actually happen. It was almost became a joke that they would say, yeah, so the Germans are really going to surrender. Really? Right? That's really going to happen? But, they went through their training, and then lo and behold, on the morning it happened, they heard over the loudspeaker, away all boarders, which was their signal to gather at the whaleboat that the mission was about to be launched.
So how do you bring the U-boat to the surface without sinking it?
Well, what happened was that after U-505 had been detected by sonar, and then Gallery sent up a couple of his fighter planes in the air, and not many people realize that the U-boat really can't get very deep in the ocean, that it's got to really, it's almost close to the surface. And the fighter planes actually spotted the silhouette of the U-boat just below the surface. And it was a beautiful Sunday morning. It was a crisp day. The ocean was relatively calm, and it was a clear blue sea. So they could actually see it. So the fighter plane started pounding it with fire, and the other destroyers engaged as well with depth charges and hedgehog attacks, mortar shells. And the hull of the U-505 was breached, and the rudder became jammed in the attack. So they had no way really of opening fire, of defending themselves. The captain was not a fanatical Nazi, even though he was a member of the Nazi Party. He had no choice but to analyze the situation in his silk pajamas and call out the order to abandon ship. So they surfaced, and the American task force continued opening fire, not this time with depth charges or hedgehog mortars, but with small caliber arms. So they knew, it was enough to get the Germans to realize that they had no choice but to surrender, to bail out of the vessel. So the hatch opened, and suddenly all these German sailors started popping out and jumping into the water with their life jackets. And that's how you capture a U-boat without sinking it.
It's very clever that it's playing the psychology of you keep it under fire, but not under fire with something that'll sink it. It's a very, very piece of lateral thinking. But my assumption is, though, there is, from the German perspective, a standard operating procedure to scuttle the U-boat. So why is it not scuttled, and why are they, because they do go, they're going to, everything's there laid out for the Americans to capture. Why does it not go down? Why is Langer not bring it, send it to the bottom of the sea?
Right. Well, part of this is the dysfunction that the crew had that goes back to the suicide of its previous commanding officer. It was always believed that they should have just disbanded all the crew members, dispatched them to various other U-boats and started off with another new crew, but that didn't happen. So it was partly dysfunction. And the other part was the serendipity, the fact that the commanding officer had just gotten out from a nap and was in his pajamas, and suddenly they're engaged in a life or death struggle. So he did claim that he called out the abandoned ship, and the first order of business would be to scuttle the vessel. But Lange, the commanding officer, popped his head out of the hatch because and it was a brave decision on his part. He wanted to be the first member of the crew to see what was going on the surface. And of course, he was cut down. He was not killed, but he was severely injured. And then his second in command popped out of the hatch, and he too was cut down, not killed, but also severely injured. So the two key guys who were in charge of U-505 were out of commission. That left it up to the third officer, the chief engineer, to take over and issue the order to scuttle. It's claimed that he panicked in the face of this engagement, and he failed to order the destruction, the scuttling of the ship. So he got out, and there was no one in charge. Sheer panic. They were there to save themselves. That's all they wanted to do. So only one German crew member, a guy named Hans Gobler, thought on his own to open up a pipe, basically, that was clamped down. It was part of the way of cooling off the engine. But if you open it up, suddenly a gush of water comes up. And he threw aside the cover, and he's thinking, well, okay, the ship is going to sink in a matter of moments. But no one, there were 14 detonation charges that were scattered around the U-505, like all the other U-boats. But no one had the wherewithal of the three commanding officers to order that they be set. So these 14 charges, which would guarantee the destruction of U-505, were never set. Neither did they throw water onto their secret code books, which were made of ink and a paper that the minute you threw water on them, they would be destroyed. And no one did that. So it was a combination of Gallery's brilliant strategic thinking and also the incompetence and the panic that the U-505 crew members that resulted in this incredibly lucky, for the Allies, this lucky set of circumstances.
It is lucky, but you've also got there's also that incredible thing about you've got Lieutenant David and his men zipping across in their whaleboat to get on board this U-boat, which presumably they know it's been hit because it's going around in circles. They must presume it's sinking, and they have to go on board potentially against in a hostile environment. There could be Germans on board shooting them. So how is that boarding process for them? Do they meet any resistance? Is it difficult?
Well, they zip across from the USS Pillsbury to U-505, which was about 3,000 yards away. And along the way, they encounter all these German sailors, and the Germans were begging them to save me, comrade, save me, comrade. But they had a mission. They ignored that because they knew that the Germans were going to be rescued by other whaleboats. So they went to U-505, and believe me, as you point out, it was spinning because its rudder had been jammed, and the top deck was slippery with blood, and of course the pounding of the ocean waves. So it was quite challenging for the 9 volunteers on the whaleboat to hook up to the spinning U-boat and to climb aboard. In fact, one of them, the very first guy to try to make that climb, fell into the ocean, was really seriously injured when he came between the whaleboat and the U-boat. He was kind of squeezed, and he severely injured his back, but they managed to rescue him. Luckily, they all climbed aboard. In fact, there's a funny anecdote in the book where Gallery is watching all this with his pair of binoculars, and he sees his guys riding the U-boat, and he calls out, "Hi-yo, Silver, away!" which is the classic American cowboy.
Lone Ranger, Tonto.
Right. So what happened next was that the hatch was already open because the Germans used that to effectuate their escape. And the order of battle was for one of the volunteers to climb in first, but Lieutenant David pulled him back and said, "No, let me go first." He very bravely decided, as the leader of the raiding party, to be the first to enter the hatch because he expected to be cut down by the remaining Germans who were expected to be inside the U-boat. It was all dark inside, so he had no idea when he climbed down what to expect, except that he expected to be shot down by the Germans. He couldn't believe that they had abandoned ship. He climbed down, and for that single act, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he became the only member of the U.S. Navy in the Battle of Atlantic to win the Medal of Honor for that act. So in any event, he climbed down. He sees this incredible sight, a U-boat, and one by one, the other members of his raiding party climb down the ladder, and they take they seize the U-boat. So the first order of business is to get that Enigma machine, to find the German code books. So it turned out to be a gold mine of Nazi naval intelligence.
But do they have the technical ability to salvage a submarine? Because they're not submariners and it's German. My assumption is everything in it is written in German. The thing's taking on water. How do they take control of the submarine to make it, I guess, seaworthy?
Right. Well, the first order of business was to plug that hole in the seacock that the German crewman Hans Gobler had left. So one of the members of the raiding party he sees this gush of water about 5 feet high, and he realizes that they've got to plug that, otherwise this submarine is going to sink. So lo and behold, he looks around and he sees the cover of the seacock that had just been thrown aside by Gobler. First, he thought, well, this is too easy, that the cover has got to be rigged with a booby trap. This is all a trap. But he lifts it up and he clamps it down and the hole is plugged. So that's good. So the immediate danger of the vessel sinking had been eliminated. Meanwhile, a member of the raiding party goes to the engine room and he tries to figure out how to stop the turning of the vessel, which was spinning around. He's a veteran of the U.S. Navy, but he's looking at all these, and they weren't just written in German. They were German in shorthand. It was impossible to even decipher. But he's a mechanic, and he knew engines. Even though he was not a submariner, he figured it out, and they stopped the engine from spinning. But in doing that, they stopped the forward motion of the U-boat. So it actually made things worse. So it was really in danger of going to the bottom of the ocean with the 9 American sailors on board. So what they had to do was figure out a way of towing it. So they got a message to Captain Gallery that they needed a tow. And first he sent in the Pillsbury, and that became a disaster. It was sliced. The U-boat is like an iceberg. 10% or so is on the surface, but most of it is below the surface. And it had a plane that stuck out with stability, and the Pillsbury went right into that plane and it sliced its hull. And actually, suddenly the Pillsbury was in danger of sinking. So it withdrew from this effort. So Gallery lost his top and said, "Oh, I'll do it myself." So he brings in, imagine the sight of an American aircraft carrier moving very close to this U-boat. He basically nose to nose. He got as close as he dare get to the U-boat. And bear in mind, they still were worried that that U-boat could blow up and with it, possibly take down the aircraft carrier. And he fired off a tow line to the members of the raiding party, and they tied it up to the bow of the U-boat, and Gallery pulled back on the Guadalcanal, and suddenly that tow line was as tight as a violin string.
It is remarkable. A lot of this is more Hollywood than you can ever picture. The events that happen in it are absolutely remarkable. How cooperative were the German crewmen? For them, the war's over, but were they of any use whatsoever to the Americans? Gallery?
Well, yes, it's very interesting. The U-boat story is, as you point out, it would be a great movie, the capture of it. But what happened afterwards is really just as dramatic, if not more so. What happened was that Gallery realized that they didn't have the experience to keep, even though the U-boat was under tow and for the moment had been saved from sinking. it was still gathering water and it was going down and down. And he had to figure out what to do to bring his prize home. So all the members of the captured German sailors were gathered in a holding pen on the Guadalcanal. And Gallery realized that there was one guy who was of Polish background, and he had been conscripted into the German Navy against his will. And he had his master at arms, which is basically the police officer on the Guadalcanal, who spoke fluent Polish. He was a Polish American. Speak in Polish to this sailor. And the sailor, his name is Ewald Felix, told his life story, how he hated the Germans, how he was forced to serve on U-505. And during this conversation, the American master at arms said, well, would you help us salvage the U-boat? And he said, yes. So they took him over on a whaleboat to U-505, and he knew exactly, he was a mechanic. He knew exactly where the levers were, and he hit the right buttons, and suddenly you could see U-505 rising further and further on the surface, and he really secured the vessel for the Americans. And later, the Germans couldn't figure out what had happened to him, his fellow crew members of U-505. And Gallery created this story that he had died of some mysterious ailment and he had been buried at sea. But the crewmen of U-505 realized that was just a tall tale, and they suspected that Ewald Felix had defected to the Americans.
Charles, we're going to pause there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking to Charles Lachman about the capture of U-505. So what's the response back in the US when Gallery reports that he's captured a U-boat and he's just, I think at this time he's heading to Dakar because he's in need of fuel. He's probably 50 feet tall, proud as punch, he's caught a U-boat. What's the response from the brass back in the US?
Well, the immediate response was dead silence, and that frustrated Gallery. But he suspected, knowing Navy politics, that they were trying to figure out what this all meant. He captured a German U-boat, and he was towing it to Africa. So several hours passed, and he finally got a radio report. You can imagine how high up the command chain it went. And they told him, no, don't go to Africa. And that was a wise decision because there were German spies in Senegal where he had planned on taking it. It was practical on Gallery's part because he was running out of fuel, and it was the closest seaport. But no, they told him, no, don't go to Africa, go to Bermuda. And he would be linked up with a tanker, and they would refuel, and a tugboat, an ocean-going tugboat, and they would take over the towing of U-505. But what was really going on behind the scenes at the Pentagon was that the fleet admiral of the U.S. Navy, King, was furious. First, he hadn't been told about this plan, and neither had his number two chief of staff. And then they had to alert the Brits that this U-boat had been captured. And the British Lord of the Admiralty went ballistic basically on Admiral King. He had to remind Admiral King that there was a larger issue at stake here, which was, if the Germans ever found out that their U-boat had been captured and possibly their Enigma machine and codebooks had been compromised, it endangered the entire ultra secret that Professor Turing, in that well-known, amazing story, that it really would compromise one of the great secrets of the war, that the Brits had deciphered the German codes and were already reading their messages. So above all else, the capture of U-505 had to be secured. And that's how they decided that the first order of business is to eliminate the name U-505 from any messages whatsoever. So they renamed this German U-boat Nemo, and the officer who came up with that was actually an English literary professor at the academy, and he was a big fan of Jules Verne, so he figured the Nemo perfect, which in Latin means nobody. It was so interesting. 3,000 American sailors witnessed this, right? Capture of U-505, and 3,000 of these men had the greatest war story of all time that they couldn't wait to tell their wives, their families, and their girlfriends back home in the U.S. Plus, they had all these souvenirs that they had taken off U-505. They had flags, U-505 pens, Lugers, leather coats, a whole bunch of stuff, thousands of souvenirs. And Gallery realized what was critical to this successful operation was keeping their mouths shut. So they had every member of the task force sign a letter warning them that the capture of U-505 could indeed shorten the war. That was how important it was. They had to keep their mouths shut, and that if anyone spoke about the capture of U-505, they risked not only a court-martial, but because it was time of war, execution, should they violate their oath of secrecy. So as a credit, it was a credit to the 3,000 sailors that, so far as is known, not one violated that oath.
And it's amazing because it's still nearly a year of war to go. So, they have to keep stum. It's not as if it happened, late in 1945. There is a lot of war to get through for that secret to be need to be maintained. But how do you keep the German crewmen from talking? Because presumably they're now prisoners of war within the US, and presumably they could write to Red Cross letters back to Germany.
Well, that was the other another fascinating part of the U-505 story. Under the Geneva Convention, you had to alert the International Red Cross that these men were now American POWs. That didn't happen. So it was without doubt a violation of the Geneva Convention. But so be it. Time of war. It was an existential crisis for the Americans and the Allied and the Brits and the Allied forces, and they felt that they were justified in this unique set of circumstances in keeping the existence of the POWs a secret from both the German families, the German Navy, and the International Red Cross. So all 59 captured U-505 crew members were taken to Bermuda under the tow. They were imprisoned in secret in a camp in Bermuda for a relatively brief period of time. And they were then transferred to a POW camp in the state of Louisiana. They were held in isolation in this POW camp for the duration of the war. They were not allowed to write any letter to their family members. They were about 2 football fields away from the other members of the POW camp. They tried everything they could. They were very imaginative, actually, in trying to alert the family members that they were alive. They actually found turtles. The POW camp was infested with these box turtles, and they wrote down on the shells U-505, and they let the turtles loose in the expectation, the hope that they would crawl their way to the other side of the camp where the other German prisoners were located. But that didn't happen. They even set off these balloons, which they very innovatively filled with helium. They created their own chemical, mock helium, and they put down U-505 on the balloons and tried to sail it away to the other camp, but that didn't work either. So it was only after the war was over, after VE Day, that the secret came out. And it didn't take long for the Navy to announce that one of the great secrets of the war, that they had captured a German U-boat. And it was only then that the German families in Germany learned that their loved ones had survived the war. They had assumed that they had been lost at sea, but no, they were alive.
In reflection, what's interesting about that publicity after the war, it's now it could be told is the newsreel, isn't it? What's interesting is it takes the position that this fact captures the Enigma machine, which cracks the Enigma code, and all this. And as a Brit, you kind of have your nose knocked out of joy, going, "But we did this, years before." But actually, it's quite a smart move because it then hides the fact that we'd cracked the Enigma code, which we keep a secret well into the 70s. So actually, it's a very subtle piece of deception within itself to hide the fact that we cracked the Enigma. We didn't want to tell the Russians that we'd done it, sort of thing.
Right. Well, it's very interesting about the Enigma code. I'm not pretending to be an expert on the code, the cracking of the code, but what happened was that people don't realize, they think that kind of it's an instantaneous read, that Turing's brilliance had deciphered the code and all the messages could be read. That's not the way it worked. It needed hundreds of hours of computer time to decipher. And the significance of U-505's capture was that now that they had the secret Nazi code books, they could read the messages without the need for a computer. They could read it instantaneously. So as soon as these messages were sent out to the various German naval vessels, the Americans and the Brits could read it. Now, secret codes change every 2 weeks. So these code books would constantly change, which is why Turing's work was so brilliant, because, the computer could decipher it at some point, but for at least 2 weeks and then beyond, they actually had 4 weeks of codes that they had taken from U-505. They could read the messages instantaneously, which is of enormous intelligence significance, because the U-505 was captured just 2 days before D-Day. So it was a breathtaking intelligence find on the part of the Americans.
Yeah, it's quite a coup. Now, before we started, I was discussing how I'd actually seen U-505 in Chicago. What is remarkable is, if people don't have their geography to mind, Chicago's not exactly known for being on the coast. How on earth did U-505 end up in Chicago?
Well, after the war, once the now could be told secret was revealed, U-505 was sent on a war bonds campaign. Imagine this German naval vessel raising hundreds of thousands of dollars in war bonds. So it went up the East Coast. And when the war was over, it ended up at a U.S. naval base in Maine. And there it sat for 10 years, rusting. And actually the plan was to blow it up, to use it for target practice. When Gallery heard that, bear in mind now, Gallery is a rear admiral, he blew a gasket, Irish temper, and he said, no. This has enormous historical significance. So his very influential family in Chicago, and in particular his brother, the Catholic priest, enlisted the support of a very powerful publisher in Chicago, and they galvanized the city there, and they raised the money. And through an act of Congress, they transferred ownership of U-505 to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. So the next order of business was getting U-505 in seaworthy shape. So they had to repair it and paint it, and then they sailed it to Chicago. They had to go through 4 of the 5 Great Lakes to get it to Lake Michigan. As you know, having visited the museum, it's right on the shore of Lake Michigan. And then they had to lift it out of the lake and, through a brilliant engineering, send it across Lakeshore Drive, which was one of the busiest streets in America, one night. And the next morning, there it sat in the backyard of the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. And that's how a German U-boat ended up in Chicago.
Yeah, it's such a fantastic display. It's a thrill to walk around and to see the star of that old newsreel, now it can be told, which shows its capture. When did that newsreel come out? Presumably it must be post-war, otherwise the secret would have got out.
Right. Well, the film you referred to was a documentary that was produced back in 1945-46 by the U.S. Navy. The old saying, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. Gallery was aware that he was making, if it succeeded, Navy history. So he had a crew shooting this whole thing. Yes, he was a brilliant strategist in more ways than one. And he recorded everything. So the footage is just remarkable. Imagine you see the whaleboat zipping across the ocean. You see U-505. You see the German sailors bailing out, abandoning ship. You see the capture. You see the towing. It's really all on this ancient but still dramatic documentary film.
Yeah, indeed. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. I'll try and find it and put a link in the show notes for listeners. Well, Charles, thank you for your time. Loyal listener, if you want to read about the capture of U-505, Charles's book is Codename Nemo, The Hunt for a Nazi U-Boat and the Elusive Enigma Machine. Don't forget, if you have enjoyed this podcast, you can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And there's a big thank you to those who are patrons, as it really helps me find the time to put the show together. So that is patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
88 millimeter gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice